Hello, I'm Kirstie Blair, and I'm going to talk about working class writing around the end of the 19th century and literary cosmopolitanism in Scotland. I just wrote a whole study of Victorian Scottish working class writers, in which I note I used the word cosmopolitan once, but it is on page 1. No, I won't go into it. It's kind of part of a setup for the argument of the book, because the argument of that book is about the significance of the local and the provincial in creating a Scottish national identity, but it's also about how the local and the provincial are always enmeshed in global and international contexts. And these contexts can be economic, political, and cultural. And some of this I've also studied in another article on Garibaldi and Kossuth and European nationalist movements and how Scottish working class writers respond to them. In terms of literary cosmopolitanism, however, and the way in which it's been studied by Victorianists in particular, working class writing really hasn't featured as far as I'm aware in any case. Amanda Anderson very influentially argued in The Powers of Distance in 2001 that cosmopolitanism at the individual level is associated with, quote, a reflective distance from one's original or primary cultural affiliations, a broad understanding of other cultures and customs, and a belief in universal humanity. And this has been picked up and discussed by subsequent critics. So in relation to working class writers, we can see why this might be problematic. It's difficult to move away from your original and primary cultural affiliations, we might think, if you spend your entire life in a small town in Fife. It's difficult to acquire a broad understanding of other cultures and customs if you left school at 12 to work full-time in an industrial occupation. If your leisure time is severely limited, you have no funds for travel. How do you acquire that sense of the cosmopolitan, and how might you come to see yourself as such? And also, if you are a working class writer, and like most working class writers, you're hoping to earn money as well as esteem, marketing yourself as local is really a very important way to do that for good strategic reasons. What I would suggest, though, looking through the archives I've accumulated for this talk, is that late century local and provincial working class writers had far more access to a cosmopolitan literary and cultural sphere than we might think, but they did not always choose to leverage this access in their works, which do remain resoundingly local. And I'll talk about two exceptions here, but those are exceptions. Most writers that I study don't really move away in the poetry that they published from what we might call standard local themes, with the occasional exception of international political topics, for example, abolitionism, or as mentioned previously, European nationalism. So if you're in your small town in Fife, working, say, in the mines, how are you going to acquire a broad understanding of other cultures and customs? Well, firstly, you're likely to have access to the local newspaper press, and it did report very widely on world literatures. So in one example here, the admirers of Heinrich Heine, and it's assumed that there are such admirers in Fife, can hear about some lectures in Vienna. Those interested in French literature hear about Sainte-Beuve, the Athenaeum, reports on Shelley and Viareggio, and then we're over to Salt Lake City to think about the literature of Mormonism. And that's a very typical example. I actually used Heinrich Heine when I was running searches to find this kind of example, because looking through my materials, Heine is the writer that is perhaps mentioned most often. That would be a whole different topic for a talk. So I'm going to kind of leave that sitting there. You could also hear about Heine in connection with Longfellow, and Longfellow is by miles the most important international writer for the Scottish working classes. In this talk, A Night with the Poets, given at the Young Men's Christian Association in Greenock. This was a mutual improvement society, and of course all mutual improvement societies, literary associations, penny readings, Mechanics Institute lectures and so forth, aspirational young men, and by the end of the century young women, could attend multiple talks in a week, and many of those talks in the local town would be concerned with international affairs and very frequently international literature. Another small example of a talk on Heine, indeed just down the road from where I am now, given by Herder Bovius, Glasgow, paper on Heinrich Heine at the Scholens Academy when it had just opened. And if you attended a talk like this and your interest was spurred, you would be able to find the latest publications on Heine, Family Life of Heinrich Heine, for example, in your new local free library. And actually studying the presence of international or world literatures or European literature in the surviving library records of reading rooms and mechanics institutes and working men's libraries, like the miners' libraries of Lanarkshire and Northumberland, would be a really fascinating topic to pursue. See me if you want to do a PhD on this, because I think there's quite a lot to say. And incidentally, the reason why there's all this interest in Heine and why he's appearing in libraries and talks and so forth is because of an act of translation that had moved Heine not into English but into Scots. These translations by Scottish writer and translator and lawyer Theodore Martin actually situate Heine within a very specific Scottish Auld Lang Syne tradition. In this example, also a tradition of verse about, nostalgic verse about a lost Scottish childhood. We creep it into the hen house and duke it under the straw. It's the publication of these translations of Heine in Blackwoods that helped to popularise his work, besides the fact that Longfellow also translated him, and besides the fact that Heine lent himself to musical settings and that those circulated and were very popular. Poet Alexander Anderson, my first example, was a big fan of Heine, and in fact his last work, published around 1900, was said to be a set of translations of Heine, but this work, as far as I'm aware, was privately printed and has not survived. Anderson's pseudonym was Surface Man. He worked as a plate layer, railway labourer in the southwest of Scotland. And he educated himself and produced his first book, Songs of the Rail, and had a very successful and long-standing relationship with the People's Friend. He was one of its leading poets, so you can ask Charlotte more about that. Having mastered English literature, Anderson moved straight on, with the aid of Cassell's popular educator, his biographer notes, to French. It was not long before he acquired a knowledge of French sufficient to enable him to read the works of Racine and Molière, and then on to German, Italian, Spanish, and indeed the classics. The interesting thing here is that though Anderson is one of the most remembered Scottish working class poets and has attracted critical attention and appeared in anthologies, he is almost always anthologized in relation to his railway poetry and his songs of labour. And there's a very small amount of discussion, quite a bit of it indeed, by me, of his nursery verse in The People's Friend and elsewhere. But in fact, Anderson publishes a really substantial number of poems dealing with cosmopolitan literary sympathies, specifically European literary sympathies. So in his ballads and sonnets and the volumes that succeeded it, he's got sets of sonnets. For instance, on the right, this set remembers a trip to Germany. You can see here that trip is mediated through his knowledge of Heine's literature about his song about the Lorelei. And on the left, this is a sonnet sequence called In Rome. Of course, the choice of sonnets to discuss your love of European literature is in itself significant. In Rome is especially significant because this sonnet sequence was actually produced before Anderson had ever left his local area in Scotland. So this is a fantasy of being in Rome. What I'd suggest, I think, here is that this is a kind of manufactured cosmopolitanism. It's purely literary, and that's very interesting to contrast to writers who are often studied in relation to the discourse of cosmopolitanism, like George Eliot, like Arthur Hugh Clough, both of whom wrote extensively about Rome, both of whom had visited Rome or lived in Rome and knew it very well. But Anderson here writes himself into that literary tradition, and in doing so, he actually creates himself as a cosmopolitan writer, not just through the poem, but because the publication of these poems meant that a wealthy benefactor funded Anderson to travel to Rome and experience it for himself. And interestingly, his biographer says, after being to the real Rome, he only altered one line of his lengthy sonnet sequence about literary Rome. The same is in part true of my second example, John Parkinson. Parkinson starts out his career in a way typical of a working class poet. He leaves school early, he works in the spinning mill, he joins various associations in Kilwinning, including the Liberal and Radical Association. And then in 1900, things take an interesting turn when he converts to Islam. By 1909, he's the vice president of the British Muslim Association and becoming increasingly well known in international Islamic circles. And in 1908 to 10, he's overseas in Burma as a newspaper editor, having left his job in Busby's spinning mill. Parkinson's Lays of Love and War is an absolutely fascinating volume because it combines these very standard poems about Scottish local scenery and history, such as Ronald and Ellen, In a Land of Moor and Heather Where the Bluebell Gaily Blows, and so on, a romance set in the Wars of Independence. It combines these with songs about Islamic jihad. In fact, Sons of Islam is on the next page to Ronald and Ellen, and there's a very interesting relationship going on there in relation to martial language and war, and how it's represented in these different cultures. Brave sons of Eastern line, glory for I be thine, laurels thy shield entwine, first in the fight. In 1904, Parkinson wasn't all that well known, but these poems and the articles on the spirit of Islam that he was publishing in the local press brought him to the attention of the community in Britain and farther afield. And in effect, by writing poems in praise of Islam, he became one of Britain's leading Islamic converts and moved into a new career that depended on this new identity. What's also fascinating about Parkinson is that there's no contradiction at all seen in the local press between being a local Ayrshire poet and being a leading British Muslim located in Burma. So in 1902, he is our townsman, Mr. John Parkinson, and the newspaper is delighted that the Muslim world is now turning its attention to the Ardrossan and Saltcoats Herald. In 1904, he's the latest and not the least of Ayrshire's poets. In 1905, he's Mr. John Parkinson of Kilwinning, the honoured of Abdul. And I like the slight sardonic note in Followers of Islam, if there be any hanging around this column, which presumably there were since they had published all these articles on the Sword of Islam by Parkinson. No one has, as far as I know, undertaken much research into writers like Anderson and Parkinson, what is happening with these international and cosmopolitan sympathies. But I think they indicate that investigating this relationship between the local and the cosmopolitan and understanding the complex ways in which these might be intertwined could be very rewarding, both in relation to working class literature and in relation to Scottish literature, in terms of giving us new understandings of the connections between national and cosmopolitan sympathies in this period.